Okay, welcome Year 12 to our lesson on natural law theory. Okay, so before we begin, let's just remind ourselves very quickly of some of the key terms. So, pause this, see how many of these you can answer. Okay, so teleological means the rightness or wrongness of an action is based on its consequences. So far we've looked at utilitarianism, which is teleological. Deontological, so far we've looked at Kantian ethics. Actions are right or wrong in themselves, independent of consequences. Natural law theory is deontological. Normative, so all of the ethical theories we're looking at are normative, means they tell us what we ought to do. Absolutism, there is absolute and objective right and wrong for all people. Relativism, right and wrong actions are relative or dependent on other factors. So Kantian ethics and natural law are absolutist. Utilitarianism and situation ethics are relativist. Intrinsic means something has value in itself. It's right or wrong independently of anything. And instrumental means something doesn't have value in itself. It's right or wrong based on what it produces or leads to. So deontological theories tend to focus on intrinsic value. And teleological theories tend to focus on instrumental value. Okay, so natural law. So natural law by far is the oldest theory that we'll be looking at. It has a tradition which goes very, very far back into the past, to ancient Greece, in fact. However, we're looking at its modern incantation or its modern version, which is Christian. Okay. So natural moral law is a Christian moral theory. So it begins with Aristotle, but Aristotle wasn't a Christian. We're going to look at Aristotle in much more detail in the philosophy of religion unit, but Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher who had lots of interesting ideas. They then inspired Thomas Aquinas. So Thomas Aquinas is a Christian. He's writing in the 1100s, so about 1,000 years ago. And the natural law theory that we're looking at is inspired, or really is formulated by Thomas Aquinas. Okay, so really quick summary of natural law. You can probably guess what it's going to be like because of the word natural. Natural law states that we should act in a way that is natural to us. So it looks at what actually is part of our nature. What is natural for us as human beings? And as we said already, Aristotle believes that we have a nature, but wasn't a Christian. And Aquinas reads Aristotle and applies his ideas to Christianity. Okay. So the natural law approach to morality has a long history. So lots of philosophers. Cicero was a Roman philosopher, and he stated, true law is right reason in agreement with nature. So the belief here is that right and wrong should be in line with what is natural. What is natural? The problem for natural law theorists is going to be what exactly is natural? What is it natural for us to do? And how do we discover this? So for Aristotle, and we'll learn more of this in the philosophy of religion unit, for Aristotle, everything in nature has a natural law. So Aristotle saw the universe as in motion. It was constantly moving and things were growing. So a really good example that we can use is the idea of a seed growing into a tree. And everything is moving in a formal or a proper way. And how can we explain that? How can we explain that if we plant a seed, we should expect it to turn into a tree, and we don't expect it to turn into a human? Well, that's because inside of everything is a natural law, a natural process, and that guides everything's movement. So if you plant a seed, you can expect it in the right conditions to naturally grow into a tree. Similarly, a fetus, an unborn child, you can expect it in the right conditions to naturally grow into a human. Now, if you put a fetus in the soil, it's not going to grow into a human. And that's because it has a different natural law to a seed. So all of nature has a law which is written inside it. And Aristotle didn't know this because he was writing more than 2,000 years ago. He was pre-Christian, so writing before Christianity. But we might now call that DNA. He didn't know that at the time, but sort of a law or a structure that's written inside of all living things. Okay, so the natural law is written inside the plant. The natural law is written inside of us as well. And we have different natural laws. So is a plant able to choose to go against its natural law? Can a plant choose to not grow or choose to be something else? Well, no, it can't. Obviously, a plant can fail to grow, but that's not choice. However, we can, and this is what Aristotle and Aquinas believe. Humans are the only part of nature that can choose to go against their natural law. So natural law is discoverable through reason. So if we use our minds correctly, it's a little similar to Kant. If we use our minds correctly, we should be able to work out what's natural for us to do. Okay, so let's say you murder somebody. For Aristotle and for Aquinas, this is unnatural. And the reason we can choose to do it is because we have freedom and we have reason. So it's quite similar to Kant in that sense. And normative tells us what we ought to do. What we ought to do, the right thing, is to follow our natural law. Okay, so Aristotle was a Christian writer. He believed that everything in the world was following a natural law, a natural process. And Aristotle inspired Thomas Aquinas, who was writing 1,000 years ago. This is still over 1,000 years after Aristotle. So there's 1,000 years in between Aquinas and Aristotle, and 1,000 years between Aquinas and us. Aquinas' writing then becomes very influential in the Catholic Church. So natural law today really is a Catholic way of moral decision making. So Catholics rely on this idea of natural law. So natural law has become a Roman Catholic form of moral decision making. Excuse me. It's largely because of the influence of Aquinas on the church. Aquinas himself was influenced by Aristotle. So this is what Aristotle says: nature reveals itself to contain natural laws. Everything is aiming to fulfill its proper function. So Aquinas was inspired by Aristotle. So Aquinas says the natural law is put within us by our Creator. So this is what Aquinas does. He changes Aristotle's non-Christian idea of natural law and makes it Christian. So Aquinas believes in God, so believes that God put a natural law inside of us and it's accessible through reason. And then this inspired the Catholic Church to say that it's the job of the Holy Catholic Church to use reason to interpret God's natural moral law to make rules for Catholics. And this is known as catechisms. So everything that you learned about in your GCSE about how Catholics are against abortion and Catholics are against contraception, condoms, this is because of this natural law tradition. The idea is that you shouldn't interfere with God's natural plan. And God's natural plan, for instance, is procreation. So condoms are wrong. And it follows this tradition. Okay. So other examples might be don't practice homosexual acts. So the church's commandments against homosexuality because it's unnatural. Okay. So there can be some criticisms of this position. We're obviously going to go into much more depth, but here are some basic criticisms. So the naturalistic fallacy by a philosopher called G.E. Moore, he said that something might be natural, but does that make it good? Okay, so it might be natural, for instance, for us to walk on two legs, but does that make it good? So this is his criticism. Just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. David Hume, another critic, he calls his position the is-ought gap, or deriving an ought from an is. And it's quite similar to the naturalistic fallacy. Just because we do something, just because it's natural, doesn't mean we ought to. So let's say, just because we reproduce, doesn't mean we ought to not use contraception. Another criticism is this idea, well, what actually is natural? I mean, for instance, earlier we said that it was unnatural to murder, but if you go throughout human history, you might argue it is natural to murder because people seem to do it all the time. Another criticism would be to say that the Catholic Church picks and chooses what it decides is natural. So the Catholic Church is against condoms because they're unnatural. But then the Pope, for example, the head of the Catholic Church, will jump on a plane. Now, the reason I use this example is because you could argue that it's very unnatural to fly. If God wanted us to fly, he would have given us wings. So it seems like the tradition is picking and choosing what it decides is natural. So these are the sorts of things that you can use to criticize natural law. So to keep this in your mind, we're going to go into lots of detail and lots of depth, but this slide here is essentially the AO1, what you really need to know, a quick summary of the natural law tradition. And then here's a quick summary of some very common criticisms of the natural law tradition. Okay, so let's see the natural law tradition in practice today. So the Catholic Church, this is from one of its catechisms. Catechisms are one of its teachings. So the belief, we've looked at this already in the DCT unit, but the belief is that the Pope, the head of the Catholic Church, has apostolic succession, which means he has a direct link back through the other popes to Peter and then to Jesus. And that means that he can interpret natural law. He can have access to the Holy Spirit. So the Pope then releases catechisms or new teachings. So here is something which really nicely describes the natural law tradition. So this is 1954. So man participates in the wisdom and goodness of the Creator, who gives him mastery over his acts and the ability to govern himself with a view to the true and the good. The natural law expresses the original moral sense. And what that means is natural law is original. It's written inside of every single human being. It comes before the Ten Commandments, for example, which enables man to discern by reason the good and evil, the truth and the lie. The natural law is written and engraved in the soul of each and every man. We remember that quote from Paul, who says, the Gentiles who do by law, who practice the law because it's written on their hearts. It's natural law. Because it is human reason ordaining him to do good and forbidding him from sin. But this command of human reason would not have the force of law if it were not the voice and interpreter of a higher reason to which our spirit and freedom must be submitted. Okay, so the natural law comes from God. So natural law is a Christian moral theory, even though it has its origins in Aristotle, who was not Christian. And you could argue that this is a criticism of natural law. It takes its ideas from a non-Christian philosopher, Aristotle. Okay, so Aquinas then, he's our main thinker for the natural law tradition. Aquinas believed that natural law was the moral code which human beings were naturally inclined towards. So this is what God gave humans in the Garden of Eden. There were no Ten Commandments, it was just natural law. God later reveals specific commands, such as the Ten Commandments, but these don't go against natural law, but rather further and develop it. This reflected Aquinas' approach to theology generally, by which natural theology, based on reason, didn't go against revealed theology. Remember, we looked at this at DCT. There's different types of access to knowledge of God. Natural knowledge coming from reason, observation, and revealed knowledge coming from prophets, revelation, holy texts. Natural law comes from reason. However, it isn't in conflict with revealed law. So the Ten Commandments will say the same thing as natural law when we use reason. So Aquinas said that the moral life is a life which is lived according to reason. So we looked at this already in the DCT unit. There are 4 tiers of law, so 4 ways of knowing God's will for Aquinas. The first one is eternal law, and we can never know this because this is God's law. This is the way that God works, and it's beyond us. Next is natural law, the natural principles that God has placed in each of us that we are able to access through reason. So a good image for this would be the Imago Dei, the idea that God made us in his image, and because he made us in his image, he left a divine spark in us. So quite similar to what John Calvin says, the sensus divinitas. There's something within us that enables us to know God. And this natural law is written inside of everything, all natural things. Then there's revealed law, specific principles that have been revealed through commandments and revelations, such as the Bible. And finally, there's human law, which are laws that we then construct based on our knowledge of the other 3 forms, or at least the other 2. Okay, so this is something that you need to know. So, Aquinas, as well as reading the Bible, was also part of a kind of a new wave in Christian thinking. And this period was called the Scholastic period. It was around 1,000 years ago. Aquinas was French, well, he was Italian really, but he was working in Paris. And at this point, the ancient works of philosophers like Plato and Aristotle were being rediscovered. So Aquinas read Aristotle. In particular, he read the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's book. And these were the things that sort of interested him. Aristotle says things like, the natural is that which everywhere is equally valid and depends not upon being or not being received. That which is natural is unchangeable and has the same power everywhere, just as fire burns both here and in Persia. So Aristotle was very interested by this. And even though, sorry, Aquinas was very interested in this. Even though Aristotle wasn't a Christian, this didn't matter to Aquinas because Aquinas believes that Aristotle was accessing through reason God's law, even if he didn't have revealed theology, even if he didn't have the Bible, even if he didn't have Jesus. Because remember, Paul says that the law is written on their hearts for the Gentiles, the non-Jewish. Okay, Aquinas also reads Paul in the New Testament, who seemed to be talking about some sort of natural law. And this is a quote we've mentioned already. Indeed, when Gentiles, who do not have the law, do by nature things required by the law, they are a law for themselves. Even though they do not have the law, they show that the requirements of the law are written on their hearts. Their consciences also bear witness, and their thoughts sometimes accusing them and at other times even defending them. So Paul seems to be saying here, even if you don't have access to Christian texts, you still know what God wants, because through reason, every human being has natural law, which is accessible to them, written on their hearts, Paul says. So natural law doesn't rely on the Bible, it relies on reason. Okay, so how do we work out if an action is good or bad? Well, here is a quick sort of summary of everything that we're going to look at. We're going to look into quite some detail at the natural law approach, but here is a kind of paragraph that you might be writing and what it would sound like. Okay, good actions are what nurture us to become a good human. So a bit like, what is good for a plant? Well, what's good for a plant is what helps it grow, what helps it fulfill its natural law. Sunlight is good, soil is good, water is good. Well, what's good for a human? What's good for a human is good behavior that helps you grow and follow your natural law. So this is where it becomes normative. Actions are good or bad if they help us to fulfill, or they don't help us to fulfill, if they're bad actions, our natural moral law. For example, affection, education, and food helps us nurture ourselves into becoming a good human, which is our ultimate purpose. However, if we spent hours sitting in a rubbish bin smoking cocaine, we would be doing a bad action, because this act does not help us to nurture ourselves into a good, healthy human. So the logic is quite straightforward. Whatever helps you to fulfill your natural law is going to be a good thing. When we do something that does not help us reach our telos, telos is a word that Aristotle introduces. It means our purpose or our goal. So when we do something that does not help us reach our goal or final purpose, and this is because in the moment we believe that it is good. So Aristotle and Aquinas think that we don't choose to be bad. When we do bad things like smoking drugs, this is because we're not using reason correctly. We think that it's good to do something, but we don't realize that it's actually bad. This means no one is bad because everyone is aiming towards a good. It might just be an apparent good and not a real good. So we'll look at that later. Reason is what helps us distinguish between the apparent good of staying in bed from the real good of going to school. Okay, so every human is trying to do good, but reason helps us to access what is actually good and what is just apparently good. Okay, so Aquinas and natural law theory. Now, in reality, the theory is deontological, because the Catholic Church will give a list of rules that you can't break. It's nothing to do with the consequences. So don't use condoms. Don't be homosexual. So it's deontological. The rightness or wrongness of actions in themselves. So the natural law approach was developed by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, in the 1200s, and became a central feature of Catholic moral thinking. To find its roots, however, we have to go back to Aristotle. So let's go back to Aristotle. Okay, so you might want to pause this and answer this yourself based on what we've discussed already. Was Aristotle a Christian? Well, no, he wasn't. And we know this because he lived in ancient Greece 400 years before Jesus was born. The foundation of ethics for Aristotle is observation. This is something you're going to learn more in the philosophy of religion. Aristotle says that if we look and observe through a posteriori means, then we will discover that everything in nature has a natural law. Examining how the laws of nature function will lead us to understand what is something's proper nature and how it should behave. How do we know how a flower should behave? Well, it's by observing 1,000 flowers. So what is in a squirrel's nature to do? Well, a squirrel is an example of something in nature. What is its nature to do? Well, we've got to observe a lot of squirrels first. So you might say find and eat nuts, for example. Now, if the squirrel doesn't do this, is it a good squirrel? The answer is no. He'd be a dead squirrel because he's not fulfilling his natural law. It's quite a simple bit of reasoning. Another example, what's in a woodpecker's nature to do? You could argue pecking on wood. If it doesn't follow this natural law, it's a bad woodpecker. What's in a fish's nature to do? Well, you could argue to swim. If fish doesn't do this, it's not a good fish. We say there is something wrong with the fish. And this is the same for anything in nature, anything you observe, Aristotle says. So it's an apple tree's nature to produce apples. If it doesn't do this, it's a bad apple tree because it's not following its natural law. So why do all these objects have natural functions? Well, because there's a law of nature written inside of them, the natural law. Okay, so you might want to pause this. This is a little activity. Tick the scenario where the apple tree is a good apple tree and cross where it isn't. Okay, so the apple tree grows beautiful apples and reproduces. Yes, it's good because it's doing what it's supposed to do. The apple tree doesn't grow apples. No, it's bad because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. The apple tree grows lemons. No, it's bad because it's not doing what it's supposed to do. And the apple tree doesn't reproduce. No, it's a bad tree. So, Aristotle, Greek philosopher, believed all natural things have a certain ultimate goal or end. And he called this telos. This is where we get the word teleological, end goal. Everything has an ultimate consequence or goal. Now it gets a bit confusing because natural law talks about telos, but it's not a teleological theory. Because in reality, it's a deontological theory, and that's because the Catholic Church makes laws. So Aristotle talks about telos, something's ultimate goal. This is the key idea in Aristotle. There's an unchanging order or principle behind the changing physical world. And from this, we can work out what something should be doing and what it shouldn't be doing. Okay, so Aristotle believed all natural things have a goal, a function. In Greek, this is called an ergon, function. So his ethical work, where Aristotle talks about ethical behavior, is called the Nicomachean Ethics. Nicomacheus was actually his son. So Nicomachean Ethics means the ethics I've given to my son, a book he wrote for his son. So, summary, what defines if something is good? If it's completing its natural function, according to the laws of nature, its natural law. What defines if something is bad? If it's not completing its natural function or following its natural law. The Greek word for function is ergon. So you can go through this table in your own time. You can either fill it out or you can just look at the answers I'm about to give. But here's an example of some natural things. And on the right-hand side, we have an example of how it might not be achieving its natural law. Now, all of these are natural except for chairs. A chair is a man-made object. And Aristotle says the same principle of natural law applies to man-made objects as well. And that's because instead of it having a natural law, we give it its natural law. A good chair enables you to sit on it. So a bad chair is one that falls apart, for example. Okay, so feel free to go through this in your own time. Okay, the important thing is to work out, well, what is the natural goal of a human then? Humans are part of the natural world, so what's our natural law? According to Aristotle, he calls this eudaimonia, and in Greek this just means flourishing or good spirits. And it just means being fulfilled on every level, intellectually, physically, spiritually, emotionally, having a fulfilled life. Eudaimonia. Okay, so that's all you need to know from Aristotle. So this idea of telos, fulfilling a goal, and he was not a Christian. So the ultimate goal for Aristotle of a human life is eudaimonia. Now Aquinas, 1,000 years later, reads Aristotle. Okay, so a very quick recap here. According to Aristotle, all things have a telos, which means end goal or function. For example, the telos of a fish is to swim. If a fish is not swimming, it's not fulfilling its telos and is therefore not a good fish. Telos establishes the laws of nature. So you might want to pause this and think about this to yourself. Why do Catholics believe it's wrong to practice homosexuality? Well, in short, it comes from Aristotle. Aristotle didn't say it was wrong to practice homosexuality, but he introduced the idea that through observation, a posteriori, we can see how natural things behave and how they should behave. And most humans, 99% of humans, have sexual relationships with someone of the opposite sex so that they can reproduce. We can see that that's natural. Having homosexual sex, therefore, for the Catholic Church at least, is perceived as unnatural. It goes against the laws of nature. Okay, very controversial, but it's the logic. Same thing with condoms. It's natural to reproduce through the act of sex. Therefore, condoms are unnatural. They go against our natural law. Abortions are wrong for Catholics because, based again on Aquinas and Aristotle, it is natural for a fetus to grow and develop into a baby. Therefore, it's unnatural to end a pregnancy. Okay? So, it was Aristotle who first developed this approach to ethics. Seeking to combine Aristotle's thought with the Catholic Church, Thomas Aquinas built on his thought and developed a system of ethics known as natural law. The Catholic Church to this day bases much of its teachings, beliefs, and practices on Aquinas' natural law theory. So, it begins with Aristotle's idea of telos, and it also begins with Aristotle's idea of the four causes. Okay, and we're going to look at this in much more depth in the philosophy of religion unit, so don't worry too much about it now. But in short, Aristotle believes that all things that are fulfilling their nature do so through four causes: material, efficient, formal, and final. And Aquinas develops this idea, and he calls this casuistry. Casuistry. So this is the process of working out what is natural and what is good. Okay, so I said already, you can look at this, and we're going to look at this in much more detail in the philosophy of religion unit, but we might want to introduce it very quickly now. Aristotle believed that everything that is created and everything natural has four causes. The first cause is the material, so for the spoon, that would be the metal. The second cause is the formal, which means the form. So that means the plan or the shape or the design of the spoon. The third cause is the efficient cause, what actually turns the material into its shape. And that might be the spoon factory or the machine that does it. And the last cause, which is the most important, is the telos or the purpose. And this is to eat. So that's why the spoon was made, was to eat. So the final cause defines all three other causes. Because you want to eat with the spoon, it has to be made of something hard like metal in the shape that will fit in your mouth by a machine that can make it. So the final cause is the most important cause for Aristotle. It's the telos or the goal, the purpose of the object. Okay, so we've looked at this already, telos. So you can look at this table. Here's an example of the four causes in action. in different things, both man-made and natural. And the final cause is the most important. Okay? So this is natural law again. If we want a seed to grow, we plant it in soil, we fertilize it, we water it. And that's because the final cause of the seed is the plant. So a seed will grow provided that we give it the correct environment. And the same is true of humans. If we want humans to grow and develop, we need to be giving them the correct environment, and we need to be using reason ourselves and accessing our moral law. Okay? Aristotle also talks about different ends, subordinate and ultimate ends. Subordinate ends are short-term goals, like I'm going to go to school today. That's not the ultimate goal of your life, but it is subordinate to the ultimate goal of your life. The ultimate goal of your life is to flourish, to have a good life. And in order to do that, you have to go to school. So this is the idea of subordinate and ultimate ends. So Aristotle believes that an action is judged right or wrong insofar as it leads us towards our telos, our goal, our ultimate end. So good and bad is how well you're fulfilling your telos. Okay, so we've looked at this paragraph already. You can read through this again. Just a quick summary of the way that natural law works. Okay, for Aristotle and for Aquinas, the inner principle of human nature is reason. We're the only part of nature that can choose to know and to go against our natural law. Okay, so reason is so important. So feel free to read through this in your own time. So to establish our natural law, we have to use reason. So good behavior is what helps us to fulfill our good. And what's good for us is what is natural for us. And what is natural for us is discovered through reason. Okay. Subordinate ends and ultimate ends. We've looked at this already. If your ultimate end is to get an A in RS, your subordinate end might be to turn up to school, just study hard. So you need to do little things, little actions, which are good in order to fulfill your overall goal or telos. Okay, so you might say the ultimate goal of your life is to be successful. In order to do that, you need to go to school. In order to do that, you need to get on the bus. In order to do that, you need to set an alarm. And it goes back and back and back and back and back, working out actions that are good because they help you achieve your natural law. And this is a process that Aquinas will call casuistry. Okay, so feel free to read through this in your own time. Okay, so Aristotle goes on to say that it's difficult to establish what the ultimate good is, but eventually he says that it is human flourishing or eudaimonia. Okay, so this is sort of the opening paragraph that I would use in a essay on natural law. Okay, so natural law is based on Aristotle's idea that all of nature is aiming to fulfill its natural law. All things are moving from potentiality to actuality. So that's the idea that all things are moving from a potential to an actual thing, from a seed to a plant, from a baby to a fulfilled human, and aiming to fulfill their natural law or telos. Telos means end, goal. Aquinas was inspired by Aristotle. Unlike Aristotle, Aquinas was a Christian. Therefore, natural law is a Christian ethical theory. Now, Aquinas changes the final telos of human life from eudaimonia to the Christian imago Dei. In Latin, that means the image of God. Our ultimate purpose for Aquinas isn't eudaimonia, it's to live in the image that God created us in. The purpose of life is to fulfill our natural law, which is to live in the image that our Creator has designed for us. Natural law is therefore a normative theory, as it tells us what we ought to do in order to fulfill our natural law. It is also deontological, because in reality, the Catholic Church issues a set of absolutist, unbreakable laws, which all must follow. And then here I've introduced sort of a criticism. For I believe natural law doesn't have more strengths than weaknesses, as not everyone is Christian. This means we simply cannot follow what Aquinas believes our ultimate goal is, which is to live in the image of God. This is because it is a Christian perspective, and not everyone is a Christian, and therefore can't be applied to all human beings. It simply doesn't work in a multicultural or secular world. Therefore, natural law is only specific to one particular religion, and for this reason is flawed. So this would be an opening paragraph. For Aristotle, you've got what Aquinas does with Aristotle. You've got the Catholic Church, you've got the key terms, and then you've got the introduction to your overall opinion. Okay, then there was nothing for 1500 years after Aristotle. Aquinas then. Thomas Aquinas is our main thinker. The writings of Aristotle have been lost in the West, but had actually been preserved by Muslims. Very interesting. So here's our first question then. If we're naturally good and close to God, this is what Aquinas thinks, right? And Aristotle, our natural nature is to be good. Why did we need the Ten Commandments then? Why do we need revealed theology? You might want to pause it and think about that to yourself. Okay, well, the answer is that we seem to not be able to fulfill our natural law. If you look at Adam and Eve, they were sinning against God from day one. So we need a little bit of help. So natural law should be followed, but also revealed law is there to help us as well. But natural law is the original law. So Aquinas believed natural law was the moral code which human beings were naturally inclined towards. God reveals specific commands, but these do not go against natural law, but rather further it and develop it. We've looked at this already. Okay, so the 4 tiers of law. So Aquinas, inspired by Aristotle, based on Aristotle's idea of the good being that which fulfills the purpose for which it was created, Aquinas believed it was necessary to establish the purpose for which humans were created. And the purpose that we were created by God, according to Aquinas, is to fulfill his image. We were made a little bit like God, and we need to fulfill that promise. This is called the Imago Dei, or the image of our Creator, the image of God. So we're going to use this chart to help make sense of casuistry. Casuistry is the way that we work out what is good and what is bad in natural law. So our ultimate end or goal, our telos, for Aquinas, is to fulfill the image of God. And in order to work out what is good and bad behavior, we need to go back and work out, well, what causes this? And what causes this? And what causes this? And what causes this? So we're going backwards in this chart. Okay, so Aquinas believes that the ultimate way that we fulfill our purpose is the principle of synderesis. And this is to do good and avoid evil. That's what we must do. In order to fulfill the image of God, is to do good and avoid evil. It's called synderesis. Okay? But at this stage, it's not yet normative because we don't know what good and what evil actually is yet. So how do we work this out? Well, Aquinas came up with 5 precepts. Precepts are natural things that we need to fulfill, natural functions that we need to fulfill. And a good acronym for remembering this is WORLD. Okay, W-O-R-L-D. And Aquinas thinks that if we all use reason, we should be able to work out that these are the 5 things that we need to do in order to live a good life. 1, worship God. 2, live in an orderly society. 3, reproduce. 4, learn. 5, defend the self and the innocent. So this is based on Aristotle's idea of efficient causes. Any action which helps us to achieve these things is good. So is going to church a good thing? Well, yes, because it helps you to worship God. And helping you to worship God helps you to do good and avoid evil, which helps you to fulfill your ultimate telos or goal, your ultimate natural law. So these are called primary precepts for Aquinas. Worship God, live in an orderly society, reproduce, learn, defend self and the innocent. From these primary precepts, we can work out secondary precepts. Secondary precepts are actions like go to church, kill someone, steal. Now, killing someone is bad because it doesn't help us live in an orderly society. Going to church is good because it helps us to worship God. So this is how we work out casuistry. Now, in theory, this means that it's deontological, because some actions will always help you to achieve some primary precepts. Lots of critics have argued that it's actually a teleological theory, because you could argue that going to church isn't good or bad as a secondary precept. It's only good or bad if the consequence is a good outcome, because you could be going to church to kill people, in which case it's not helping you live in an orderly society and it's not helping you to worship God. But in reality, because the Catholic Church took over the natural law tradition, it is still a deontological ethical theory. Natural law then is deontological because we have a fixed and absolute human nature. It's an absolutist theory. Everybody has the same nature. Actions will always be right or wrong, depending on whether or not they help us or lead us away from our telos. Okay? So read the Bible. Good action. Why? Helps you worship God. Which helps you do good. Which helps you fulfill the Imago Dei. Don't steal. Good action. Why? Helps you live in orderly society. Helps you do good and avoid evil, which helps you fulfill the Imago Dei. Don't use condoms. Good action. Why? Helps you reproduce, which helps you do good and avoid evil, which helps you to fulfill the Imago Dei. Don't be homosexual. Good action. Why? Helps you reproduce, helps you do good and avoid evil, which helps you live in the Imago Dei. Go to school. Good action. Why? Helps you to learn, which helps you. You get the idea. Okay? Now, how do we actually work out these secondary precepts? Well, it's through using reason. So reasoning correctly allows us to understand secondary precepts. How do we actually reason correctly? Well, it's by practicing virtues and avoiding vices. So you need to use reason correctly. There are 4 virtues which are incredibly important. Virtues are just characteristics that you practice throughout your life. There are 4 virtues which are important: prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. Prudence means being careful. If you are careful, you will use your reason correctly, which will help you to work out correct secondary precepts like don't use condoms, which will help you fulfill this, which will help you fulfill this, which will help you fulfill this. Another virtue is justice, being fair to people. Another virtue is fortitude, which means courage, courage to do the right thing. And another virtue is temperance, which means self-control. And these are called the four cardinal virtues. There are also three theological virtues, which are added by Aquinas later, which are hope, love, and charity. Okay, so in order to work out secondary precepts, we reason correctly by practicing virtues and avoiding the vices. The vices are the 7 deadly sins. Pride, so thinking you're better than other people. Greed, wanting more for yourself. Lust, wanting sex. Gluttony, wanting lots of food. Anger, you know what anger is, losing your temper. Sloth, which is being lazy. And there's one more here which I've missed, and I'm not sure why. I will tell you in the lesson. I can't quite remember it, what it is off the top of my head. I think it's avarice. Avarice, which means desire to steal. Okay. So if you practice the vices, you're likely to be led away from your correct reasoning and then led away from fulfilling secondary, primary precepts, synderesis, and your ultimate good. So sinning for Aquinas means to miss the mark. You're aiming at something, but you're not fulfilling it. So to sin means to try and be good, but you're not practicing the virtues, you're practicing the vices. And so you're aiming for the wrong thing. So if you kill someone, that might be because you're not using reason correctly. And that might be because you're angry, which is a vice, anger. And that means you're not fulfilling your natural law and you're aiming at the wrong thing. You're aiming at revenge. And you should be aiming at the correct thing by reasoning correctly, by practicing the virtue of temperance or self-control. So this is the idea of apparent versus real or ideal good. So Aquinas believes God makes human beings with a certain ideal nature. And this nature enables human beings to use their reason and their experience to understand what is right. Immoral actions or sin, according to Aquinas, are not carried out because of evil. No one wants to be bad. Humans are fundamentally good, Aquinas, because we're all created by God. The reason people do bad things is that they confuse ideal or real goods with apparent goods. So morally wrong actions are carried out by the individual who's mistaken. They believe something is good, but it's only an apparent good. It's only apparently good. It's not really good. So if you don't use reason correctly, you confuse real goods with apparent goods. Okay, so let's go through this backwards. Our ultimate telos or goal for Aquinas is to fulfill the Imago Dei. We do this by doing good and avoiding evil, the principle of synderesis. We do this by following the 5 primary precepts. We follow these by working out actions which fulfill these precepts through reason. We reason correctly by practicing virtues and avoiding vices. If we follow the vices, the 7 deadly sins, then we will reason incorrectly. We will chase apparent goods instead of real goods, and it will lead us away from our natural law. A little bit like the woodpecker who starts pecking metal. They're doing something which takes them away from their natural law. Or the tree that starts growing down into the soil, the seed that starts growing down, it's doing something bad. It doesn't realize it, but it's doing something that's taking it away from its natural law. So the idea of sinning or choosing something that you think is good, but it's actually not, this happens in Genesis. Adam and Eve don't want to be bad, but they choose the apparent goods of eating the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And because they do this, they're not reasoning correctly. And they're not reasoning correctly because they are practicing the vice of, well, you can work it out yourself. What vice are they practicing? Pride, most people would say, thinking that they're better than God. And they're not practicing the virtue of prudence, being careful, temperance, self-control. So this is one of the reasons why revealed theology is needed in Christian ethics. So Adam and Eve chased an apparent good and not a real good. So pause the video now and think to yourself, apparent or real good? Remember, real good is something that helps you fulfill your natural law, and apparent good is something which takes you away from your natural law. So think to yourself now, are these real goods or apparent goods? Okay, so taking drugs, you could argue, apparent good. It feels good in the moment, right? You are aiming for something good. No one wants to be bad, but the good you're aiming for is pleasure. Pleasure isn't a real good. Helping your mum, well, that's a real good because that's going to help you live in an orderly society. That's going to help you to do good and avoid evil. Working hard, well, that's a real good because that's going to help you learn one of the 5 primary precepts. Skipping school, that's not a real good because it's taking you away from your natural law. It's taking you away from the primary precepts of learn. So why do you do it? You do it because it feels good in the moment. But that's an apparent good. It's not a real good. And that's because you're not using reason correctly. Same with lying and same with killing the fat man. They are apparent goods. So it's a bit like a tree that doesn't grow its leaves. You're not helping yourself to flourish, to function as a good human being, to fulfill your natural law. So, God creates man with an ideal nature, human nature that we can all potentially achieve. But because we're made in the image of God, we have freedom and we have reason, which means we're free to go against it. So, like the seed reaching its potential of flowering, however, to sin is to fall short of this ideal, literally meaning missing the mark. People often miss the mark because they confuse apparent good with ideal or real good. For example, drinking alcohol may make me feel more sociable, the apparent good, but the ideal would be to feel self-confident and sociable without having to alter your body. What would Aquinas believe about the following? Abortion, homosexuality, genetic engineering? I think he would say that they are apparent goods. They seem good, but they're not actually real goods. And this is a controversial idea then, because Aquinas is very optimistic. He seems to be saying that no one wants to be bad. When people are evil, it's just a mistake. So arguably, that means that Hitler wasn't evil. He just was not using reason correctly. Maybe because he was blinded by the vice of jealousy or anger. So that is a controversial idea. It's the idea that no one is bad. It's just a matter of ignorance. No one freely chooses to do evil. They simply choose an apparent good rather than a real good. You might want to debate this. Do you agree? In Hitler's mind, he thought what he was doing was good. But that was out of ignorance. That's what Aquinas would argue. Okay, so this is a good place to pause it. There's a lot of information that we've just gone through. This is only the first half of natural law. I am still going to try and get through it in a week, but for the sake of revision and recap, I'm going to divide it into 2 lessons. So in this lesson, we've learned about what natural law actually is, its tradition, its beginning with Aristotle and the idea of telos, the idea of nature trying to fulfill a natural law. We looked a little bit at the 4 causes, and we looked at ultimate and subordinate ends. Then we looked at Aquinas, who develops Aristotle's theory into a Christian model, and the idea of casuistry, which is the imago Dei, synderesis, primary, secondary precepts, reason, virtues, vices. And then we looked at apparent and real goods. And we've also looked a little bit at how the Catholic Church uses natural law. Okay, so I'm going to make another video with the second part of natural law theory. Okay, thank you very much, Year 12.